Hello everybody, this is my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Beatrice Weder di Mauro, who has joined the Institute 3 years ago. Beatrice is still the research professor at INSEAD in the Singapore campus, and she has been the president of the Center for Economic Policy Research, one of the biggest think tanks in economic policy, which is based in London. Beatrice, it's a pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure, Grégoire.
So we're here to talk about the themes of the special issue of global challenges that we prepared at the Institute, which is on the weaponization of economics. And there has been a lot of talks about the rise of economic nationalism in different countries that is being marked by the proliferation of unilateral sanctions or trade prohibitions, trade restrictions, or different prohibitions in trade in high-level technologies. So the first question is that do you agree with the characterization of these new trends as weaponization of economics or militarization of economies, or is it going too far?
I don't particularly like the expression weaponization, but it does convey, in fact, quite well what is happening, namely that both trade and finance are being used in passively aggressive or also aggressive ways against certain countries. And, well, you could call that weaponization. It's not something new, though. It has been increasing. So if you look at sanctions, simply, sanctions as an instrument have been deployed more and more, and many of them were sort of below the level of where the general public would know this. But there are studies that have counted the number of sanctions, and when you look at how these have been used increasingly over the last decade, even actually in the last 2 decades, it's clear there is a rising trend. And in fact, there has been a rising trend of globalization on the one hand side, of integration, and at the same time an increasing use of sanctions as ways to punish what was perceived or is sometimes rightly perceived as unfair behavior. So the good thing, to turn this into a good story, one could say, yes, weaponizing economics is better than using actual weapons. Yeah.
And so you just said that we actually observe the two trends going hand in hand, globalization on the one side, and on the other side, the proliferation of sanctions as an example. So these questions, recent talk that has started to appear about these trends coalescing into a new system, no longer globalization, but something called maybe slobalization, or if you want to characterize that it's still a trend toward globalization but slower, or even deglobalization, that we are actually seeing a shrinking and maybe a re-regionalization of the world trade or financial orders. So do you think these terms are helpful, or are we not yet seeing which trend is taking?
Well, the words may be helpful to describe different possibilities. There is a fourth possibility that you have not mentioned, which is basically chaos, or one in which, or I would then call it opportunistic, where we have all of those happening at the same time, some areas that keep integrating others, and area now I mean not a geographic area necessarily, some industries that succeed in integrating others that disintegrate more quickly, and what I do think will predominate is the regional pull, gravitational power of neighborhood will become more important than it has been in the recent past. But I do actually also think that there is the possibility of this non-system where it's kind of hard to call it one name, because you have many different expressions across industries and depending on where you are. We don't know yet, and that's part of, we're talking here ultimately about geopolitics as the driver. And it's not economics anymore in the sense that the economic solution is almost always one in which higher integration leads to more, if not welfare, at least material production, right? It's more efficient. It's more efficient to do the things where they can be done most efficiently, and that is the world scale is the right way to look at the most efficient way to produce. So any deviation from that will be less efficient, will be more costly. We're seeing it today very, very clearly how to, in a disorderly and quick way, have to disintegrate what that means for prices, right? It's a very, very clear and present demonstration of the fact that it's more costly. So we are going into a world where it will be more costly, yes, than the one that we've had in a globalizing world. Yeah.
You've already anticipated my next question, which is about the causes of this change. You said geopolitics, in a sense, is a factor. Everybody has in mind the war launched by Russia against Ukraine. Before, there was already some disruption in global value chains because of COVID. We thought initially COVID maybe actually bring more cooperation across state boundaries, which not always happened. Before that, a lot of political analysts talks about the excesses in terms of economic nationalism of the Trump administration. All these are somehow external factors that are not internal to the functioning of markets. But I'm wondering if that's the only explanations, that these are these external shocks that may come from geopolitical factors sometimes, or health factors like a pandemic, or if in a sense the trend isn't coming from a failure of globalization to give all that it had promised in terms of growth, in terms of reduction of inequalities. So is there not also maybe internal market logics, in a sense, that explain why some skeptics and skeptical voices about globalization have started to be heard?
Okay, so I would say that calling this a failure of globalization is a mistaken view of what the market can do and cannot do. The market does not solve distributional problems. It solves efficiency problems. So to the point where the increasing, and let's call it by name because we know quite well what happened over the last 30 years. This globalization is essentially one in which we have brought something between 1 and 2 billion people into the global labor market, about 1 billion out of poverty, and they have basically started being part of this global economy. The ones that were losing in this process can be also quite clearly identified. They tend to be the ones that were competing with those things that the new entrants, and those are, a lot of them are in China, were doing at a better rate, at a lower wage and efficiently. So there are losers, there were losers, but this is always, that's not completely expected, that when you open to trade, there is those that lose and those that win. The point is always that those that win are more than those that lose. That's what where the efficiency comes from. And now, how to handle the distributional problem is a problem of the political system and of the society. So I would argue that in Switzerland we also have this, right? Switzerland, it's a very integrated economy, but at the same time, yes, there are regions in Switzerland and there are industries in Switzerland which do suffer from more integration. Agriculture, we protect it. And some regions up in the Alps, well, what do they get? They get a lot of transfers. So a regional policy that is in tune with what society wants in terms of distribution can and has to, I would argue, counteract the at least short-term winners and losers problem. Mm-hmm. In the Anglo-Saxon world, there has been much, much less of this kind of, well, on the one hand side, consensus that there should be some redistribution. On the other hand side, they didn't do it. And then they find themselves with the left behind in, the Virginias and other places in the US and also in the UK. And the huge differences between the cities and these left-behind countrysides. And the next thing, they turn around and they realize that these two people cannot talk to each other anymore because they kind of live on different planets. Now, is this a failure of globalization? No, I think it's a failure of local government to actually address these problems ex ante. So, in that sense, I dispute it's inherent or failure of the system of globalization. It is a failure, however, at the government level. Yeah.
And if we now turn to the actors who are driving the process toward maybe the fragmentation of the global order, what are your views about the role of the private sector? Because on the one side, if we follow the discourse on globalization and the role of private actors seeking efficiency and seeking to try to produce goods in a less costly way, we would think that they would try to resist the push toward fragmentation. On the other side, we see that and there are rational actors anticipating regulatory changes, and for instance, we read about, for instance, big banks like HSBC who consider maybe changing their corporate structure, having a European entity separate from an Asian entity. So we can see that some of the private actors may actually be accompanying this process of fragmentation or have multiplying effects in a sense once their expectation is set that this will be the trend. So what is your overall view of the role of the private sector?
You cannot have a view of the private sector as a whole. Those companies that have been very at the frontier of expanding the value chains and actually moving both production, employment, but also markets out of the rich world into the poor, let's call it like this, and now see themselves faced with the possible future of that these very, very long supply and value chains will have to be, reduced, re-regionalized, and friendshored, as it is sometimes called now. Of course, they are not. It's not their wish to do this. And again, I mean, look at Europe, look at Switzerland, at the multinational companies in Switzerland. This is a tiny market here for the whole machine cluster, in the European machine cluster. Yeah, China is now not only a place for production, it's also a huge market. A lot of the product is sold there, a lot of the profit comes from there. So yes, those companies will not be happily withdrawing from China, but they are also at the same time clearly, looking at the new world and wondering whether they will have to and how to how to anticipate this. HSBC, by the way, which you mentioned, I think is not such a case. The HSBC story is even more interesting in a way because Penang, a giant Chinese insurance company, bought a large stake in HSBC, and they have been pushing for a split off of the Asian business from the rest of the bank. So, and the HSBC management is resisting this very strongly. They are convinced that they want to remain an integrated global bank. But this is, in my view, one of the interesting case studies. It will be an interesting case study because now we have Chinese activist investors that are pushing for regionalization. And of course, you know, at the end of the day, given that in today's world everything is at least partly political, it will be a very interesting case to follow, in fact.
And so what is your view about what regulators can do maybe to resist these trends? For instance, do you think the European Union is well prepared to accompany firms to resist this push towards regionalization? Or
no, the European Union has to be busy securing its own regionalization and making sure that this bloc here, that this club actually works. I mean, there is so much to do, which has very much become evident in this war. It's about, securing energy. It's about securing energy sovereignty to a certain extent, but at the same time being able to rely and by being diversified on suppliers and much more accelerated green transition, and that will not be something that you can do at the national level. So so the European Union has a lot of not only challenges but also opportunities to actually do something in the region. So in a way, I think this new world, to a certain extent, should favor the governance in Europe becoming more cohesive, simply because it has once again become obvious that everybody on their own is not a very good strategy. This said, I am not, a blue-eyed, or what is it? Blue-eyed, yeah? Optimist who just says, oh, it's only, a bicycle that can never fall over. This said, I do think we have quite some challenges in front of us. Even this winter, it will be very interesting if things get very hard, whether there are the national tendencies of, this is my gas, I have it in my storage, and I'm not sharing my electricity with you, whether that kind of behavior might return, which we saw essentially in the first wave of COVID and was only slowly overcome in the subsequent waves. Yeah.
And here we're talking about one of the richest economies. What about the developing countries? Do you think they will be very negatively affected by these new trends? Do they have the means to mitigate some of these effects?
They are still trying to see which side they are on, many of them. And also in the short run, it's not... I was just in Washington at the Inter-American Development Bank, yeah, and the question was, going around the table, all of the regions basically doom and gloom and perfect storms. And the Latin American region, in the end, on net, they may actually come out positive from this. Why? Because they are commodity exporters and food exporters. At least some of the countries are. So in the short run, it's one has to be careful to differentiate. But now we're talking about the current crisis, which hopefully will, and even the inflation crisis, which hopefully is something that we can overcome within the next few years. The longer-term issue, and nobody expects that to go away. The longer-term issue is the confrontation between China and the US, and the the fact that it will be very hard to stay neutral. I mean, Europe cannot stay neutral between them. They have been able to do that for a long time, but now I think that is gone, especially if China is allied with Russia, or at least tolerates the Russian aggression. So a lot of the rest of the world are still sitting on the fence. We see this very clearly in the UN voting patterns, but also in the fact that they now have allegiances on both sides. They have debt that they have taken. For many countries these days, China is the largest creditor. Sorry. So the world is in a very undecided situation right now. But one thing is actually quite certain, that there is a very, very small probability that the rivalry between China and the US will de-escalate.
If we zoom in on one country on which you've produced an e-book with some co-authors, which is the case of Ukraine, and the type of economic policy that Ukraine should adopt in order to sustain the war effort, what is your vision about what's being implemented at the moment in Ukraine? Do you think the level of aid and the type of economic policy that is implemented could allow Ukraine to sustain a protracted war?
Well, not at the moment, no. The problem right now is that almost all wars are in part financed through the inflation tax. In other words, the government needs to spend, and it uses in part the central bank to finance that. Ukraine has been doing that to the tune of about a third of its budget deficit, which is about 5 billion per month. About a third of that came from revenues, own revenues, about a third from abroad, and a third from the central bank's direct financing. Inflation is already between 25 and 30%. And increasing. It's not higher because there are all sorts of lids that are keeping the steam in. And in fact, what we wrote, this was a new product. It was what we called a rapid response report, because it was in fact actually put together within 10 days. And with a group of 6-7 co-authors, so you can imagine that was an intense exercise. But it was also in response to a call from the Ukraine, who people there were seeing and are seeing that the macroeconomic situation is not sustainable. And when I say not sustainable, in this case, it's not not long run sustainable. It's going for crisis fast. I mean, there are two solutions. One is the friends and funders of the Ukraine fund actually what they have promised, and that would mean, in the case of the European Union, releasing the 8 billion that are still blocked quickly. So the rest of the world should be funding. After all, I mean, one way of looking at this, the Ukraine is sending their men to the front, and on top of that, paying for it with the inflation tax. I mean, this is pretty outrageous, right? So that's one solution. The other is, if the funding keeps not coming or not coming sufficiently, then there is no other solution than they have to restrict their expenditures. And that will be everything that is non-military. They will have to reduce expenditures. But at the same time, and this is what distinguishes this report from a typical IMF report, this is a war economy. So we do endorse all sorts of lids to keep the situation under control, namely imports, capital exports controls, import taxes, But one lid where the pressure should be taken out is the exchange rate. So we suggest a bit more flexibility in the exchange rate while still keeping some predictability through a limited change per day. So announcing a change per day that will be acceptable, and that will limit the depreciation. It will still lead to what is called a real appreciation, because inflation will be higher than the depreciation rate. But it will take out some of the pressure from that system. So what I have described is a very brief description of how they can survive in a wartime mode for a bit longer, because it seems that this may last a bit longer.
And do you think this system of fixed exchange rate has a chance to be adopted?
I think it has a chance, yes.
Okay. If we are going to end on a less gloomy note than what we discussed, with the energy crisis in Europe and in many countries, there has been a lot of awareness-raising campaigns about climate change and the changes in our consumption levels that we can bring in order to reduce our carbon emissions. So do you think that this new world international economic order will be more welcoming to environmental concerns being placed at the heart of economic policy making, or do you think it will be quite still a decoupled goal?
I thought you wanted to end on a positive note. Let me try the positive. For Europe, yes. For the rest of the world, I don't think so. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Weder di Mauro, Beatrice, and we look forward to having many more conversations here at the Institute on this theme. And thank you very much.